fine. Um, Mike, I'm kind of assuming you're gonna drive this. Is that
Um,
at least
can
to
you
start
hear
with?
me?
I can. Can everybody else?
Yeah. Well, sure, Chris.
Well,
You want me to go ahead and kick this off?
I I I think so.
Okay.
We could wait a couple minutes just to be sure, but I think people are mostly here.
Okay, then I'll ask folks if there are individuals. Let me just do a head count of what I see in the chat box and make sure that there's no one who is on the phone but not otherwise logged into the system. And so I see Bob Burhans and Chris, of course, and Christine Bevick, who spoke earlier. Dominique is listed, Erica Martin, Jen Horney. Is there anyone else who is on the line whose name I did not call? Okay. Well, shall we begin, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I think we should go ahead.
Okay. Brian, do you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide? Or to slide 2, thank you. Okay, so the agenda today, as shown here, 2 big items, 2 major items. First, a project update, and then secondly, we want to get into the weighting approach. And Chris, I think at that point, I'm just going to turn it over to you to orchestrate that discussion or moderate it. But for
That's
now,
fine.
is it? Okay, good. Okay. Let me give you all a brief update of where the project is from a 35,000 foot perspective, where we've come since the last time this group met, which was obviously a month ago. Looks like we've added Glenn and we've added Jacqueline. So welcome. And let me just briefly describe. We had a model design work group meeting in April, and to give you a sort of a brief overview of what happened at that meeting, the model design group talked about really, I think the major national frameworks that have to do with national health security. And looking at those frameworks and thinking about whether the current index framework that we utilize has significant gaps that need to be added. And so there was a conversation about that, as well as whether we needed to, really exactly how we were going to identify new measures to add to the index. Now, as you know, our goal is to ultimately, over the long term, to pare down the total number of measures to focus on quality as opposed to quantity, and to make it a more efficient index that has greater discriminant power and perhaps less noise going on within it. And so who knows how this is going to play out eventually. But I think what we envision then is something that has maybe more domains. Currently we have 6, and fewer measures within each domain. So that was the thrust of the model design work group, taking a supply and a demand approach to try to figure out which measures to add into the mix, to, again, identify the major conceptual gaps and to see what kinds of measures would help operationalize those gaps, and then simultaneously look at some of the existing measures, item measures that have been, well, that were considered by the previous group. And there were, I think, about 18 or 20 measures sprinkled across roughly a half a dozen different subdomains within the current structure that we were going to consider. And there are various other places from which these measures are coming from. Then we had a National Advisory Committee meeting also in April. And at that meeting, this was just really a few weeks ago, maybe about 3 weeks ago, late April, April 28th actually. So it would be about 2 weeks ago. We really just presented the National Advisory Committee with a series of questions to try to stimulate conversation on some of the major issues surrounding the index. That is to say, what kind of criteria, at least with respect to the analytic methodology work group, what kind of criteria might we use to evaluate new measures? What are the major goals as they see it for the index, its major purposes? Because that, of course, would drive some of the decisions on the construction, the conceptual design, as well as the method used to create the index. So that gives you kind of a brief update. We're moving along in these various work groups. And now with respect to the second item there, the weighting approach, what you see there on the slide is more or less the same as what was on the slide a month ago. But we didn't really get to weighting when this work group met. So we wanted to revisit that. As you know, the current index does not have explicit weights assigned to item measures, subdomains, and domains. And what we would like to do is become, but that doesn't mean that they aren't weighted, because they are by virtue of the way that the measures are aggregated and averaged. And of course, we went through that a month ago on what some of the implications are of that implicit weighting. We want it to be explicit. And so that's what we want to talk to you today about. And we want it to reflect the underlying science. Could you go to the next slide, please, Brian? And again, just as to remind you, this is the current computational structure. I have here the implicit computational weighting. We have 6 domains. There are 18 subdomains. Depending upon how you count items, there are between 178 and 194 items distributed among these 18 subdomains. And could you go to the next slide, please, Brian? At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Chris and ask him to guide the discussion on really what would be the best way to weight these items, these subdomains, these domains in the index. Chris?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So as Mike said, I think our next main task, last time we discussed and I think sort of settled the question about scaling. It's at least a reasonable approach at this point. And the next question, which, to some degree is intimately involved with scaling as well, but we've separated the two, is the weighting. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free to jump in. The way it's currently weighted in the structure of this is each one of the individual items, Mike said, 197 of them, receives an equal weight in the subdomain, and then each of the subdomain indices is equally weighted to arrive at a domain index, and then those are equally weighted to arrive at the full index. Is that right, Mike?
That's right. Brian, go back to the previous slide, please.
Yeah. So just looking at this, all of the I'm sorry, all of the elements in the, say, health surveillance and epidemiological investigation, and I think actually I can pull up my copy on my computer, but are equally weighted in arriving at the index, and they're within that cell. And I believe there's 6 of them in that group, if I've counted quickly right. Um, and then those, uh, there's, I'm trying to do this really quick on this. Anyway, there's about 6 of those in there, so those are equally weighted with a 1/6 weight. And then the 2 subdomains, health surveillance and epidemiological investigation, and the other subdomain, biological monitoring and laboratory testing, which also has a number of elements which were equally weighted to arrive at an index for the biological monitoring one. Those 2 are then averaged, equally weighted to arrive at the health security surveillance subdomain. And then the 6 domains are equally weighted to arrive at the overall domain. And so what that implies is that, for example, if you look at the healthcare delivery domain, it has 6 subdomains, and some of those, pre-hospital care, for example, has 6 or 8 elements in and of itself. And so the weight that that an element in pre-hospital care gets in the overall index is different than the weight an element in the health surveillance and epidemiological investigation subdomain gets in arriving at the overall index. And so we've talked already a number of times about different approaches to these weights. One, of course, being that we simply essentially get rid of the multi-level and simply give all 197 elements an equal 1 over n, 1 over 197 weight in order to arrive at a final index. But there are a couple of other approaches that we could use to do this. And the one that has been suggested the most, or has been suggested that seemed like it had some support, at least at our initial meeting. Brian, if you could go down one slide again, please. Would be to, thank you, would be to use, no, I'm sorry, the other way, one slide. Thank you. Would be to use a Delphi approach. That's still, we would still need to come up with the parameters of how to do the Delphi approach. And there's a couple of different ways to do it, but that's kind of where we want to begin today. Let me just sort of toss out, too, some of the different ideas for a Delphi approach. You know, one would be to say, let's let the Delphi people try to weight everything, all the way from a measure, an individual measure, up through how that measure gets weighted in constructing a subdomain index, how the subdomain indices get weighted in arriving at a domain index, and how the domain indices get weighted in arriving at the primary index. That would be the most complicated, and I personally would worry that no one would participate. On the flip side, we could do a very simple thing and say, look, here's the structure of the index. We have 6 domains. How should those be weighted in arriving at the main index? Or we could go ahead and have them concentrate on any sort of part in between. So that's the what gets weighted measures, subdomains, or domains. So I think that's the first question we want to toss out there is, assuming that we do a Delphi approach, which part are we interested in having the participants weigh in on for weights, pun intended?
Well, since nobody else seems like they're going to weigh in, this is Bob Burhans.
Thanks, Bob.
I think we really need to think what we want the weighting to accomplish. And I think if if we decide what is important to accomplish in the weighting, I think then the choice of which one of these becomes easier. I mean, one of the problems I have with weighting the domains is, for instance, if you look at countermeasures, there's one domain that we don't see on that chart, which is non-pharmaceutical interventions, which when you look at countermeasures in its totality is extremely important. So how do you weight a subdomain that actually has how do you weight the domain when you have a subdomain that's absent? That's an important part of that activity, yet right now the index doesn't approach it effectively. So you might make the decision that because non-pharmaceutical interventions is not part, then maybe countermeasures would in your Delphi approach would be less important. The other problem I have with it's not a problem, it's more of a conceptual problem, and going forward is if these potential weights could be different for each type of an event. For instance, countermeasures might not be very important in a flood, but it might be extraordinarily important in a pandemic. So I think those are some of the things we're going to have to grapple with. I think it's almost important to try to understand what we're trying to accomplish with the weighting and come to a decision on what we're trying to accomplish, and I think that'll make the decision on what we do a lot easier.
This is Julie. I was thinking also, if the type of event matters, shouldn't it be an attribute in the process as well? I mean, because it doesn't seem like a problem necessarily that the weights would be different. It's more that we should have some type of way of capturing that as an attribute with respect to the decision.
This is Chris again. Bollinger again. Let me respond just briefly to both Bob's and Julie's comments. I think, Bob, you're right in that we do need to sort of figure out what we're trying to accomplish with the weighting. I'm very sympathetic to that argument, and Mike and I have talked about it at length. At some level, though, I wonder if maybe we're thinking too hard about this. But I think we can go back, and I think what we're trying to accomplish is to come up with an index that has some ability to discriminate between areas that are prepared for myriad things and areas that are not. And that might be as profound as we can ever really get. And with respect, I'm not quite sure how to respond to, I don't think we can include I'm not quite sure how to respond to your comment. about the different, including the different aspects, because I heard Bob saying aspects like whether you're, essentially earthquake versus pandemic, and I don't see how we include those, so maybe I'm not understanding.
So I guess my point was that we don't currently, but maybe we should, because I don't think it's a problem that, I would expect that the weights might be different, that someone might be better prepared for one type of event than another, but couldn't we include an attribute that indicates like the type of event, so the weights would be conditional on certain types of events? And so you can have a higher score in one category of events than another.
This is Bob Burhans. That's exactly, being a retired preparedness director, that's exactly what has happened across the country. One of the first things you do is a hazard analysis to understand what are your most likely hazards that you're going to be facing, and there's no doubt that you put your resources into meeting the things that you're at higher risk for. So what you said, I think, is true. There are some states that are better prepared for natural disasters than they are for intentional events such as biological, chemical, or radiological events, where those issues just don't come high up on their list of risks and hazards. So I think what you're saying is absolutely true, and that is part of the problem we had when designing the original index. We took an all hazards approach, and that's why all of the domains were ranked equally, because we felt that it was a general all hazards approach to preparedness. So, I will tell you again, because I was involved in the index in the past, that there are some measures that right now receive more weight than I think an expert panel would give them. I think that that's a true statement, and I agree with that. And that may be an approach, is taking a look at the individual measures within each subdomain and weighting the measures that are more important, giving the measures that are more important more weight than some of the other measures. So, I'll tell you, within each one of the subdomains, there are good measures and there are okay measures. And right now, they, at least within each subdomain, are treated equally. But again, there's an implicit weighting as you tally it up to get the final score. But so I guess for each one of the subdomains, I would like to see the measures within the subdomain measured. So I'll throw that out as my recommendation and listen to the group's comments.
Hey, this is Glenn. I'm really enjoying this discussion. I think this is very, very rich, and this issue about, do we go down the pathway of trying to come up with a hazards or specific or risk specific weighting strategy versus staying with the all hazards approach, I think is an important one. I wonder whether is it helpful to think about, at least at the first stage, recognizing the index as it currently exists, it does take an all hazards approach, and also most of the federal or national frameworks for preparedness and response that we have to use as guidelines also kind of use that all hazards approach. If we were to kind of stay with that, at least for the short term, could we think about, does it make sense to think about there being at least a core set of measures and a core set of constructs that are represented in domains and subdomains that really should apply to to every state, regardless of their specific risk profile. So the concept that you need certain kinds of capabilities to prepare for and respond to emergencies, really regardless of what the nature of that emergency is. and maybe that's a way of thinking through. That's the index. First and foremost, should represent well those core capabilities that really that every population, every resident of the U.S. should be covered by, regardless of where they live and regardless of the particular risk profile they face. And maybe our weighting strategy should first and foremost, be designed to do a good job of representing those core capabilities that are really, again, independent of the specific risk profile, whether you live more in a fire-prone versus earthquake-prone versus flood-prone environment. We'd want the index maybe to first and foremost represent that core set of cross-cutting capabilities. Is that kind of a philosophy? Well, I would just wonder how that resonates.
Glenn, this is Chris Bollinger again. I'm gonna jump in. I mean, does that suggest that we might rethink subdomains and domains completely and think in terms of, instead of the type of subdomain we have now, which is like kind of topical, that a subdomain might be, these core one subdomain would be core competencies, and then other domains, or one domain would be core competencies, and then other domains would be risk-specific competencies?
Possibly. I guess I was thinking, when I was using that term core competencies, I was thinking about really potentially the current framework that we have, potentially those represent, these core competencies, because again, the index originally was developed with this kind of all hazards perspective in place. I think my own perspective, and based on my own knowledge of kind of, again, the frameworks that are out there, but also the state of the science, the state of the evidence around these areas, is that moving into a risk-specific or hazard-specific kind of a framework is going to be fraught with a lot of other kinds of uncertainties, and probably is going to be a longer. I mean, if we go that route, it would be a longer-term proposition.
Yeah, I will tell you, just because we've had day-long conversations about this on the team that delivered the index to its current location. I guess we felt that you needed, so you could compare apples with apples, we wanted a national index which was all hazards based. But one of the things that we would have loved to do is to come up with a weighting scheme that applied different weights to different and I'm not going to use the term competencies, I'm going to use the term capabilities to stay consistent with Presidential Directive CPD-8 and some of the other capabilities-based approaches that we based the work on. But I think that was aspirational. It's something we would have loved to do. There's an all-hazard score, and then for a pandemic, the following become more important and are weighted differently to calculate a score. If it's a natural disaster such as a hurricane, then that would be another score in a different weighting scheme. That's where we would have liked to go with this. We just ran out of time, and as you can see, it's a fairly complex activity. So I think that would be one approach that I would love to see going, which I think would really help to be able to compare states in a similar region that face similar threats. Because I think the all hazards approach, which I believe is the right approach to a national scale, does not really lend itself for making comparisons between states because of that. The risk profile is different.
I think if we do take the all hazards approach initially, I think getting weights on the domains is particularly important as opposed to focusing on the overall. I think it would be important to have weights at the different levels to try to incorporate at least some personalization.
This is Christine Bevick. So just to follow up on what, Julie, what you were saying about going to the weights at the subdomain. So right now, the number of measures within each domain varies. And so would it be helpful to, I mean, with that, that means that the equal weighting, whether there's 5 measures or whether it's 12 measures, when you roll them up, then they're then given equal weighting. So whether you have 5 or 12, those 5 measures then have a heavier weight than those other 12. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Christine, this is Mike.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's what's going on.
So yeah, so if we adjusted it, then it'd be going back to something similar. One way would be back to the 1/197, but whether or not that's something we want to do. And I think what Bob hit on about differentiating between the good and the okay measures is something that we might want to talk a little bit more about, because there are those measures that will update annually versus those measures that are remaining relatively static because of data updates. And those are not so good over time, and maybe perhaps identifying those as well.
Mm-hmm.
That was a whole bunch of stuff I just threw out there.
I mean, I think classifying the dynamic measures versus the static ones would be important. Pick one of the things that you said, right?
Yeah, because if you're using data that's 5 years old, the value or importance that it might have would be less than something that you have a measure of every year.
Fortunately, I have to drop off the call. I have another meeting that starts 5 minutes ago, but
Thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks.
But going back to the good versus the okay measures that Bob, that you had mentioned, that might be something where we could use the Delphi panel to assist us with identifying, using an all hazards approach for that. And then later, if we want to come back to them on a risk-based approach, then at least we've whittled down those measures before we start asking them to differentiate them across various hazards. So that would be, if we are looking to ask, to use a Delphi approach, then that's one way that we probably could use it and gain some value.
Yeah, I think that needs to be done, and there may be another question as they wrap their head around it. They take a look at each one of the subdomain and the suite of measures in each subdomain. The other thing that I think would be very interesting to have that expert panel to do is to weigh in on to what degree they think the measures actually measure. so those indicators, how well they actually measure the capabilities of that subdomain. I think that would be a very interesting exercise all by itself. One of the things I struggled with is I think some of the suite of measures do a very good job measuring the capability, and then I think there are other subdomains that may even have several measures. It's not that they were short on the number of measures, but the quality of the measures just in other words, there are certain factors and certain tasks that you have to be able to perform in order to meet those capabilities, and how well do we actually measure those component parts of the total subdomain. I think that would be an interesting question to have an expert panel look at as well. We talked about it as a potential deep dive or a following the same process of the measure detail sheets that were put out, to create a separate detail sheet for each one of the subdomains and talk about, the strength of the measures and how well that capability is actually measured at this point in time. So that's another thing I think is interesting for the panel to take a look at.
Can you hear me? This is Jackie Merrill.
Hi, yes, we can hear you, Jackie, please.
Can't tell it. I forget whether it's blinking or not blinking means it's on mute. I'm concentrating on a number of things. I think the Delphi panel is probably very important for you to do because you're really looking for some rigor, some real evidence for making the decisions. And that's what I'm hearing over and over again as we meet and as we talk on these phone calls. We're wanting to put forth some hard evidence about why we did these things and why that was the best thing to do. In some ways, I think you, the small group of you that are working on this closely from day to day, actually have the answers to all the questions that you're asking us. You have the insight, you've been working with it over time, and you've seen what really makes sense. But I think getting that documented improves it's believability, actually, the credibility of the instrument. Being able to say, we asked this number of experts and this was our finding, and I doubt that they will contradict yours. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is it clear?
Yeah, this is Chris again. I think I think you have a good point. Mike and I have talked a number of times in the last couple of weeks about the weighting, and as I've sort of dug into it a little deeper myself and talked with him, I think we have Mike and actually Dominique, he's quite quiet, but I think they have a very much better understanding of how different things are likely to move this index. But I think there is a sense in which we don't just want to let statistics and mathematics drive how this index comes out, that there should be some expert insights into, look, these measures or these domains are really important in assessing preparedness versus other measures which may not be very important. So I do think that a Delphi approach, I have to admit to being in general skeptical of Delphi approaches, and I sort of initially was opposed to that idea, but I've come around some personally. I think that a Delphi approach would provide, just as you said, a justification for the weighting structure that was sort of easy to defend in a way. I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm explaining that well.
That's exactly what I was getting at. When you're working with in something like this that is this complex with this many nuances, you have to be really deeply engaged with it over a long period of time to really come to see what's the right thing to do. And for those of us who have domain expertise, but we may not have that day-to-day contact that you've had for this period of time, we're going to be close, but not exactly on the money, perhaps. And there is certainly value into the new insights that outsiders can bring in. It's not that that we shouldn't be involved, but I'm placing a lot of credibility on the things that you are saying and that the insights that you have come to over the close contact that you've had with the questions or the items, all of them. That's all right. Go ahead and do whatever kind of method gets you some hard facts or some hard data that can back up some of the decisions that are made. So I'm all for Delphi. And one of the things that is going to come out soon, and one paper is already out on this survey that we did of the mass fatality infrastructure, and in that there's not a lot of data on measuring actual preparedness, but in that we do have some correlations and even a regression just showing what predicts what. So what question actually tells us, influences other levels of preparedness. So, how if the staff is reported to be highly prepared, then what's the relationship between the other things that people report? So that paper is out. If you want, I'll send it around to you.
Yes, please.
So it's called Factors Associated. Oh, no, not that one. Actually, that's another one, too. There's another one we have about willingness to respond. But this is mass fatality preparedness in the death care system.
Yeah, this is Glenn. Just to throw out a related idea that has come up in some of our discussions during last month's work group. And one we also, I think, floated at our first in-person meeting of this work group was the idea of if in addition to coming up with a national consensus-based way of weighting the index, using a Delphi process, and maybe even if we go the route of also coming up with risk-specific weights using some related Delphis, if we convened a Delphi specifically on hurricanes or earthquakes or other or pandemics, and had weighting schemes developed through Delphis that look specifically at those risks. The other idea that has been floated around is also building into the index or building in specifically to the website for the index an ability for individual users to specify their own user-defined weighting schemes and have users be able to reweight the data according to their own communities or perhaps their own states' perspectives on which constructs should receive greater weight, and therefore adding in yet another level of kind of customization, or another level through which users could weight based on their own context. So that was another idea. I think, again, mathematically pretty easy to build in a feature to do that, and even based on kind of web programming. But that it would be great to hear folks feedback on that as another way of another add-on to the weighting, and to allow for even greater heterogeneity in terms of the importance of individual measures, or at least the importance of at the subdomain level importance of these constructs.
This is Erica. Sorry, I don't know if that works. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Yeah, sorry, I'm commuting and trying to do this. So I really like that idea, and I'm wondering if we have experts, can they help us even think through, maybe we could sort of offer like 4 or 5 different types of communities. So it might be overwhelming for the practitioner to log in and change all the dials and levers, but if they were able to say, okay, these are 5 different types of communities, pick the one that best matches you, and then they could pick that specific customization.
I had similar thoughts in terms of the Delphi, that maybe what we would have would be subgroups that then focused on different aspects.
Oh, this is Erica again. So I think one of our jobs, right, is to convey the information in a clear way. So I guess which would sort of support this idea of just thinking through maybe a handful of preset tailored communities that we could offer. Not that I have any ideas on how we would decide what those community types are. I guess that would be the next question. But certainly other simulators like Rethink Health already have these sort of prefabricated communities that you put into the model so that you're not having to make up every single input from scratch. It might be overwhelming to give our users too much control.
This is Chris again, and I'm not hearing any more comments. Where I kind of take us for where we are is that I think we all agree that the current weighting system is probably not as close to the ideal as we would like it to be, and that what we think we would probably like to do is move forward with some kind of Delphi approach in order to obtain a weighting scheme. And the big questions that perhaps we here can work on are the ones raised perhaps initially by Bob, but also echoed by Erica of, what kind of index are we looking for? Do we want different weightings for different types of either communities, as Erica has pointed out, or different types of risks, as Bob has suggested? And how do we see the Delphi panel sort of weighing in on not only what the weights are, but maybe some of those questions too, as to how this should be weighted? Is that kind of a reasonable statement of where we are, that maybe what Mike and I in particular, and in concert with Dominique and Glenn, can kind of take back and work on this month before our next meeting?
This is Erica. Yeah, I think that reflects it. And I'm actually wondering, since there's the two other work groups too, it might be good to bounce the ideas off them. So, as someone who's not a domain expert in preparedness, I'm just not really sure what are the right communities to think about, but they might have some interesting ideas on how we might want to break that up.
Any other thoughts?
Chris, this is Mike. I just want to make everyone aware, in case you're not looking at the chat box, that Glenn has typed in a comment that reads, regarding all hazards versus risk-specific weighting, an article in last month's Science magazine makes the case for all hazards thinking and planning, and then Glenn provides the link. And so I think, Erica, you're just on the phone. I guess this is mainly for you, just to make you aware of that resource that you cannot see.
Oh, great. I'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
All right. I think, in the interest of time, it's almost 3, and we try to keep these meetings to an hour. I think I summarized it. I didn't hear any strong objections. So I think that gives Mike and I and others here sort of an approach. Obviously, if you have any comments or thoughts afterwards, please feel free to send them along. We're always interested in your input. And so I'm going to wrap us up and sign us off. Thank you all very much for your time. It is very much appreciated. We recognize that it is valuable time out of your day, and we do appreciate your input and help on this. So I'm going to say goodbye, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Chris, great job. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.